everyone, Heather here with PersephoneReturns.com, and I am back with part 3 of my series on relocation astrology and astrocartography. And today we're going to be talking about sort of the main event of a relocation reading, which is the relocation chart. And so this chart is essentially if you were to relocate your birth chart to any location in the world, what this does is it shifts the location of the planets and the aspects to different houses. So it doesn't change the difficult aspects in your chart, but it changes the context and it changes what you do with this energy. And it can make things either more difficult for you or a little bit easier for you, depending on what lines you're on, which we discussed in the last video, which I will place the link for that in the description below, and also where the planets are located in your chart. You can take difficult aspects and difficult planets. A lot of people consider, their Saturn placements to be problematic because Saturn always brings delays, difficulties, and lessons. And you can place that Saturn, right, especially if it's in a very difficult position, in a house that it'll work more toward your benefit, where things will flow a little bit more easily. So an example of that would be taking Saturn and relocating your chart so that way Saturn, instead of being maybe in your second house of finance, maybe it's in your sixth house, right? Which could cause a little bit more hard work, a little bit more in terms of like delays and maybe difficulties in health and things like that, but it'll open up some energy for you to bring in more money and resources, probably because you're going to be working really hard. And Saturn tends to do well in the sixth house. Other things that you can do with this is to take like a difficult sun placement, like if your sun is in the 12th house or in the 8th house, where it's sort of hidden away and it's difficult to connect with your identity, to connect with that feeling of success out in the world. Maybe you have a sun that's sort of challenged in a lot of different ways by a lot of different aspects, and it's in one of those hidden houses. And so what you could do to sort of lighten the load and to lighten up your perspective on life overall, when you take the sun and move it from the 8th house to, let's say, the 9th house, the 8th house is very dark, it's very secretive, it's very intense. It deals with things like obsession, addiction, power struggles. It deals with things like death, transformation, other people's money, deep psychological issues, triggers, and traumas. And so there's a lot of intensity and heaviness to having the sun in the 8th house a lot of times, unless you're using that for something very specific. And so you could take the sun out of the 8th house if you're having a difficult time with that, and you can put it in the 9th house. So that'll lighten you up quite a bit, because the 9th house is all about expansion. It's about learning through experience, right? Expanding your mind, expanding your knowledge base through the experiences that you have, through higher educational pursuits, through going out and having adventures, through travel to foreign countries. All of these different things fall under the realm of the 9th house. And so that'll shift your focus, right, from this intense sort of energy where you're focused on getting to the root of different issues, where you're focused on deep psychological issues, where you're focused on being obsessed with whatever it is that you're doing. I mean, it's great to have the sun in the 8th house because you're going to be focusing on your passions very intensely, but it doesn't make for, it's not as much fun, right? So maybe you want to lighten things up. So anyway, these are just some examples of what you can do when you relocate your chart. And we're going to get into this with a couple of different examples. But before we do that, I do want to just mention again, for those who don't already know, I'm doing a really in-depth 4 to 5 hour webinar on astrocartography and relocation. I'm going to be doing this on September 15th live. And if you're not able to attend live, I would still recommend registering in advance, because if you register before September 15th, you're going to get $10 off the webinar. So not only do you get to have the potential to see it live, you also will get $10 off. And if you can't see it live, you'll get the recording anyway. So it all works out, and I'm going to be answering everybody's questions. We'll be doing a lot of different examples. I'm going to be letting you guys practice with me there. So it's going to be very hands-on. We're going to do example charts with some people from the class too, so you can volunteer to have your chart read. And so it's going to be really in-depth, going into everything about astrocartography and relocation, from timing of a big move or a big vacation to the best places for you to live in terms of like the atmosphere or the energy based on your birth chart. So like, should you live in the mountains? Should you live near the ocean? Should you live in a big city? What should your home look like? How should you decorate, right, in order to feel happiest in your home environment? And then we'll get into the astrocartography map much more in depth than what we did in the last video, and we'll go really, really deep into the relocation chart, because there's only only so much I can do in a short video. The relocation chart is very complicated. And so, yeah, the link for that is in the description below. So if you want to register, you could absolutely do that. We'll go into all these things together. But today we're going to be going into the relocated chart, and I'm just going to be doing essentially like a tutorial and a demonstration on this. And so I chose a celebrity, someone that everybody knows. And when I was thinking about who I wanted to choose for this, I thought about my past experiences living in different places and different celebrities that lived in these different cities. And the first person that really came to mind was Vince Vaughn, because I lived in Chicago for about 4 years. And every single person, if you ever lived in Chicago, like you probably know someone who's run into Vince Vaughn, right? Like that's a thing in Chicago for some reason. And it's very specific to Vince Vaughn. I don't know anyone who's ever told me that they lived in the same building as Oprah, or their neighbor knows Oprah, or they've run into Jerry Springer or Obama, right? There are plenty of people who are from Chicago who are well known in that area, but it's not the same in the sense that everybody has a story where somebody, ran into Vince Vaughn somewhere. And so it's kind of a weird thing that I noticed. Everyone thinks that they've met Vince Vaughn. Maybe they have, right? And so I wanted to see what was going on with his birth chart. And what I found was incredibly interesting. And so I'm going to share that with you because he wasn't born that far from Chicago, but I figured because he was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we have his exact birth time, an accurate birth chart that's been verified through his birth certificate, and that's very important again for doing astrocartography and relocation, because this has to do with those cardinal points which shift in degree and shift on the map very like in a very big way, even if you're like at 5 or more minutes off. Even a couple of minutes can make a difference, but especially if it's more than 5 minutes off, the reading is going to be incorrect. The chart's not going to be the same, especially on that astrocartography map. So you need an exact birth time. And so this is a person where we have an exact birth time. I have an experience, with his energy being in a certain location. And so I thought this one would be quite interesting to do. And when we look at the relocated chart, the other thing that I want to point out is that people always ask me, do you look at transits to the relocated chart? And what if my chart now is relocated and my ascendant, in my birth chart is Scorpio, but where I'm at right now, it's Libra. So what do I listen for in the videos when I listen to my forecasts? All of these types of questions. Your birth chart is always predominant. Your birth chart will always be the predominant energy. The relocation chart essentially just describes your experience in a certain location, and it describes it very accurately. And so that's what we're doing when we're looking at the astrocartography chart. It shows you your experience in that location. It shows you how you use your energy in that location, either more effectively, or maybe it's hindered or blocked in some way. And so if you're having difficulty, especially if you move to a new location, right, and ever since you moved there, everything's been going wrong, or on the opposite end, everything's been going right, it could be because of your relocated chart. You don't have to be sitting on one of those lines that we talked about in the last video to have some sort of shift going on here. And so we're going to get into all of this. And so I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see what we're looking at here with Vince Vaughn's chart. And this was just super interesting. I thought this was maybe you guys will think it's interesting to any of my astrology nerds out here. But so this is Vince Vaughn's birth chart. And so first and foremost, he is kind of like known, apparently, because I did some research on him, he's kind of known in the real estate world for like buying and selling a lot of properties. And this is because back in like 2010, he got married to a real estate agent. And what's interesting about that is that he has Venus in a conjunction with his descendant right here. If you can see, this is Venus. This is his descendant. The descendant represents your partner in marriage. And if you look right here, his Venus is actually in this really nice trine here with his moon in the second house of finance. And so he married a woman who is a real estate agent, right? The moon represents the home and property, and he's making money through making real estate investments and buying and selling properties with her. And so I thought that was really interesting. It's very true to his chart. The other thing that is very interesting, as soon as I saw this chart, I saw that Jupiter was close to his ascendant, but it's in a different sign. It's in his first house, but it's not on his ascendant. And so before I even looked at his astrocartography map, I was like, I bet that he has his Jupiter line going through Chicago, and that's why everybody sees him there, because when Jupiter is on your ascendant, it's like you have to be out in the open a little bit more. You have to be exposed. People are going to see you. They're going to gravitate toward you. Even if you don't necessarily want that being Well, he has a Libra rising, so it's a little different than being a Scorpio rising. But even if that's not what you're trying to do, it'll happen. And so people, when they have Jupiter hit their ascendant, they're seen more, they're recognized more, people are more drawn to them, they're seen as more charismatic, more likable. They have to put themselves out there. And so when Jupiter's on your ascendant in your relocated chart, you're going to be putting yourself out there a lot more, and you're going to be seen a lot more because it expands on your identity in that location. So you'll be known in that location, or at the very least, you'll be out there more. People will be running into you, recognizing you. You'll feel more charismatic, more outgoing, more optimistic in this location. And it feels good to be on your Jupiter ascendant line. It's a very good feeling. And so for Vince Vaughn, what I noticed that I thought was just super interesting, I knew it was going to be on his ascendant as soon as I saw that. And so if you look right here on this map, it's not directly on that line, but it's within 100 miles or so, and that's going to make that Jupiter energy on his ascendant very, very strong in the city of Chicago, which is, you know, where he lives and where he owns property, and where everybody just happens to run into Vince Vaughn. I knew there had to be something going on there with his relocation to make that so, and that is very much a good example of having Jupiter on the ascendant in such a big city with millions of people wandering around. Everyone's running into Vince Vaughn. So anyway, that I thought was just so funny. So in his relocated chart so he has two different places where he lives. So I did a little bit of research on this because I wanted to kind of talk about his life and his chart and how it would play out. I don't know that much about him in general, right? I just know that he owns properties in Chicago. He lives there. But he also lives in the LA area. He has multiple properties there. He's just put a property up on the market in like Hollywood Hills or something like that. So there are two relocations for him that I'm going to be looking at and comparing. And first, I'm going to talk about the Chicago one, because that one I think is most interesting just because of the stories that I always heard when I was living there. And so as you can see right here, it puts Jupiter very close in a conjunction with his ascendant. And so there's not that much that changes because he was born in Milwaukee. Right? No, Minneapolis. He was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's not that far from Chicago. But what this does, if you can see in this chart, it shifts his Jupiter from this first house here onto his ascendant in Scorpio. It also takes his sun, which is in the sixth house. He has a difficult sun. It's conjunct Chiron in the sixth house. Sun conjunct Chiron is sort of like an awkwardness with the identity. It can make you feel sort of ashamed of who you are out in the world. It can bring a lot of different things, wounds and difficulties with the father, or the relationship with the father could be associated with Chiron conjunct the sun. But the main thing about his sun is that it's in the sixth house, right? The sixth house is the house that has to do with hard work, with your day-to-day routines. When you have the sun in the sixth house, you tend to be very busy, and you tend to be very focused on, you know, the day-to-day grind, worldly pursuits, right? Doing things out in the world in real time. And so, you know, that's just the nature of having the sun in the sixth house. The sun indicates the soul's expression of purpose and physical reality, right? It's what you need in order to feel satisfied and successful in life. And for him, having the sun in the sixth house, he needs to, first off, there's probably some sort of focus on health and healing and things like that that we might not necessarily be aware of, but you need to be working really hard in order to feel like you're being successful, in order to feel like you're connected with your purpose. Also doing something where maybe you're doing something in service of others, but I mean, he has this, you know, also in the sign of Aries, which is a little bit more self-oriented, right? Focusing on what you need, want, and desire. You know, Aries wants what it wants when it wants it. And so anyway, he has this sun in the sixth house, which is a lot of work, right? It's not as much fun. And so when we relocate his chart to Chicago, not only does it put Jupiter on the ascendant, which is just a feel-good placement for Jupiter, it just helps you to feel really good about yourself, your life, everything that it is that you're doing out in the world. You just, overall, it feels like things just flow a lot more easily. You would gravitate toward or really like a place where your Jupiter line is going through, especially if your Jupiter is aspected at least somewhat nicely, right? So he has Jupiter. It's, you know, there's nothing really terrible going on with Jupiter. It's in the sign of Scorpio, which is fine. He just had his Jupiter return. But it's in opposition to Saturn. Jupiter-Saturn opposition, not the worst thing. it shows that he probably understands his limitations a little bit better than some other people might, right? Especially with that Jupiter being in his first house and being so close to his ascendant. But so this highlights his Jupiter. If I were to highlight any planet in his chart, just based on looking at his chart, because that's something else that you have to look at when you're doing a relocation, is before you even go in and start looking at the lines on the astrocartography map, you have to know what their placements are, because you could highlight, somebody's sun thinking that, oh, putting the sun on the descendant like it is right here, this is great for relationships. But as you can see, he's got this sun, Chiron, and Uranus lines all connected, right? Because he has the sun conjunct Chiron opposition to Uranus. And so highlighting his sun line is also going to highlight all of these lines. When you highlight his sun line, it'll also highlight that opposition to Uranus that you can see right here. Another thing too would be like if you were to highlight his moon. His moon is quite nice, right? It's a very adventurous, optimistic, outgoing, expansive sort of moon. He feels most satisfied on an internal level when he has his stuff together in terms of his finances, right? In order to feel emotionally and subjectively satisfied, safe and comfortable, he need to have first off, a beautiful home, right? And he has many apparently, but he'd need to have a good financial foundation, financial security, right? And investments in maybe different countries or something like that too could be helpful. But so his moon is in the sign of Sagittarius. It's in a really nice trine with Venus, which is beautiful, right? That's really nice for having balance in the emotional experience, having a close relationship with your partner or with all people. He can connect with people on this deep emotional level, even if you don't necessarily see that in him. And he can do that very easily. He can help people to feel very comfortable when he interacts with them one-on-one. But at the same time, his moon is in square with Pluto, so you have to consider that, right? So if you highlight his moon, you're highlighting that Pluto square, and that Pluto square to the moon is emotional intensity. He's probably a very passionate, very emotionally intense person, even if he doesn't show it all the time. He's got a lot going on beneath the surface. He feels things very deeply. He could also be a little bit psychic or a little bit intuitive, like he can really read people on that emotional level. And he would be someone who would be very sensitive to betrayal. And so you'd have to note that you would also be highlighting that, and obviously let the person that you're doing the reading for, or take this into consideration for yourself, that yeah, you're highlighting these good things about the moon, but you're also highlighting the difficulties. And so you can find that your emotional experience in a moon line place, if you have the moon in square with Pluto, that your emotional experience there will be it'll be intensified. And so if you're already somebody who experiences these really intense emotions, these ups and downs, right? Very black and white. When Pluto is involved, it works in extremes. There can be extreme highs and extreme lows, and you're going to be highlighting that as well. So you have to take that into consideration. Like, yes, his moon has a lot of great things that I think could potentially make up for that, but you have to also look at that Pluto. And so that's just something to kind of be aware of when you're looking at the relocated chart. But for him, going back to this energy in Chicago, the other thing that changes for him, and this is a slight change, but even a small change, right? For just a few hundred miles, Chicago's not that far from where he was born, can change things in a way that's significant. And the other change that it makes is that it puts his sun in the 5th house. And so of course he would, like living in Chicago. His Jupiter line is on his ascendant, and the sun is in the 5th house. The sun is sort of accidentally at home in the 5th house, because the 5th house is the house that's associated with Leo things. It's associated with things like generosity, children, play. It's where your hobbies and your interests and the things that you're passionate about because you love to do them. It's where those things sort of lie in your birth chart. And so when he has his sun in his 5th house, the sun in the 5th house feels much more optimistic, much more expansive, much more playful. Instead of having to toil away and work all the time, right, and focusing so much energy on work and the daily grind, he can loosen up and do things that he loves to do. He can go out more, right? The sun in the 5th house rules things like bars, restaurants, concerts. It's going out dancing, doing things where you're sort of out on the town, right? Very sort of Leo-esque sorts of things. And so putting the sun in the 5th house indicates that he's going to be out and about. He's going to be enjoying himself. He's going to be doing things that he loves to do. This is a great location location for him for romance and opening himself up to those types of possibilities for romance and for play and for fun. And so this would be a place where he could feel like a kid. He could tap in to his inner child, and he could do the things that he's truly passionate about, and he could have a lot more fun here. So this is a place for him where he would feel a lot lighter. Like I mentioned before, shifting that energy, right? Shifting the energy from the sun being in the 6th house, which is a little bit more difficult, a little bit more task oriented, and moving it toward the 5th house so he can find more fulfillment, and he'll feel really successful, really happy, and really vital, because the sun is also connected to that vital life force energy. And when you're not connecting to the energy of your sun sign, you can feel depleted, you can feel depressed, you can feel like there's a lack of that vital energy, right? And so putting the sun in the 5th house for him, that's going to make it so he can connect with that vitality through engaging with his passions. And that's, not a bad place to be, right? His passions in terms of the things that are fun for him. And so that's kind of the main change when he, goes to Chicago, right, versus LA, which we'll get into. And so when we look at his map, let's go back to this. When we look at his map, we can also see that through Los Angeles, it's near his sun descendant line, which can be good for connecting to some sort of romance or something along those lines. I get the sense based on these charts that he probably enjoys being in Chicago more than he enjoys being in the LA area. I think he probably has a home there or multiple properties there if that's the case, simply because that's where he has to be for work, right? Because he's an actor. And I'm going to show you why. But when you go to Los Angeles, Hollywood, this whole general region here, you're highlighting that sun descendant line. So that's going to put the sun right on the descendant. So the sun in the relocation chart shows where your focus is shifted. So you take on, your identity takes on a different context, or you tie in your identity with something different. And so his identity is very much tied into the connections that he makes in this location, his relationships. Relationships are a focal point in this location for him. Whereas in Chicago, the focal point is more like play, fun, romance, that type of energy. And so if you look at what's going on here, this is his relocated chart for Hollywood, California. And it does put the sun right on that descendant. It puts Eris on the descendant, which can indicate that he can come into relationships that are quite disruptive, that sort of reveal to him his true nature through a disruptive experience. The things that are really good about this actually isn't the worst placement for him for relationships. This is actually really good for him for making connections with other people and making the right connections that are very balanced, harmonious, and positive with other people. Because if you look at his birth chart, he has Saturn and Mars in his 7th house of relationship and marriage and partnership and contracts. When you have Mars in the 7th house not only represents your marriage partnerships and your close relationships, it's also the house of open enemies. And so, he can make a lot of enemies very easily, and it's like not necessarily a secret with him. Like, he'll know about that. And it can also indicate arguments and disputes in relationships that are just very intense, very one-sided, very passionate though. He needs like that really intense passion in his relationships, especially in his marriage partnership. And Saturn's there too, which brings delays. It brings longevity. The contracts that he forms, the bonds that he makes with people, they're long lasting. But there's a delay there, right? And there's also a delay in marriage, and he didn't get married until he was 40. That's not super late, but that's a delay, right? That's a delay in terms of the traditional time frame when it's socially acceptable that everybody just gets married like in your 20s and 30s. So there was a little bit of a delay, not a huge delay. He's got Jupiter in opposition. His Saturn's not the worst thing. Saturn in the 7th house brings longevity and long-lasting relationships. And it does make relationships a little bit more work though, right? You have to really work at it. Whereas like Jupiter in the 7th house, relationships would just come easily to you, as long as your Jupiter was nicely aspected. Got to put that disclaimer in there, because I get people sometimes that are like, my Jupiter is, on this location and I don't understand why things are going so wrong, or I'm having this really great transit to my Jupiter. And then I look at their Jupiter and it's like the most afflicted planet in their chart. That's why, right? Even Jupiter can't withstand all of these hard angles and aspects. It's a little bit easier than with other planets, but it's not going to be like a how you call it, like a cakewalk or something, to use sort of an antiquated phrase there. Okay, so going back to his chart. So what we're talking about here is his relocated chart in this location in LA. And so what this does is it takes these difficult sort of planets. These are the two traditionally malefic planets, Saturn and Mars. They both can cause difficulties and problems, delays, arguments, aggression, frustration, especially when you have Saturn and Mars together. It's like this energy of really wanting to push forward with something, and like you just can't quite make it happen, and it's very frustrating. It's like you keep hitting these walls. And so, you know, moving to Hollywood or LA, that could actually open up some energy to make some more beneficial, more balanced, more harmonious connections. He would have much better communication in his relationships and in his contracts. He'd be less prone to arguments, disputes, delays, frustrations, and difficulties in his relationships in this location. Even with Chiron there, I mean, he's going to have some healing to do in this place. It's going to highlight the need to heal through past wounds and past traumas in relationship in order to move forward. But that's not necessarily the worst thing, right? It is a place of healing. And, you know, you can't have everything perfect in anyone's chart. It's usually not possible to have like this perfect location. You can do the best you can, right? Though you can do the best you can, because you still are going to have positive and difficult aspects. But the other thing that this does for him, so he has better communication, better balance in relationships. Relationships are more of a focal point. He finds himself in relationship, like he finds his identity through relationship, a little bit more so in this location than in other locations. And, you know, he's very proud of the partnerships that he makes here, because the sun indicates pride, right? It's the sun on the descendant, and that's like very literally being proud of your marriage partner, or being proud of your friendships, or being proud of your connections. But the thing here that makes things difficult for him, that's actually going to be Uranus, which is on his ascendant, right? And so Uranus on the ascendant brings disruption. It brings unexpected surprises and unexpected circumstances that sort of shake things up and throw you for a loop and cause you to have to change something very dramatically and drastically. It's usually very sudden. It's very shocking. It's very unexpected. And so in this location, he can find himself coming into issues where he has just a lot of really unexplained or unusual situations that come up for him that disrupt his energy, that disrupt his relationships too, because this is in opposition to his descendant, right? That's part of this when you're looking at the ascendant. But it's a disruptive energy. And so he's going to need to be constantly keeping on his toes, changing things up. You know, buying and selling different properties and moving around is one way to do that. But he's going to need to be doing things that are exciting, that are new, in order to utilize that energy in a way that's not going to be detrimental to him. So he's going to constantly be changing things up here. The thing that's good here, though, another thing that's good here, in addition to taking, you know, Saturn and Mars out of his 7th house, would be that it puts Jupiter on the 2nd house cusp. It's not fully in the 2nd house. It'd be better, you know, maybe just a little bit further away where Jupiter would be in his 2nd house fully, but that would also put Uranus closer on his ascendant. So you kind of have to weigh the benefits and costs of that, right? More disruption, but more money. Because Jupiter on the 2nd house cusp very literally expands on your resources. Money can flow in much more easily in this location for him. Neptune is still in his 2nd house, though. When you have Neptune in the 2nd house, which I believe is how it is in his natal chart, yeah, money kind of flows through your fingertips. It comes in very easily, but it flows through it's kind of hard to keep track of your resources. Not that that would be an issue for him, because, you know, he has plenty of money. So if he spends sort of wildly, or if the money flows out, it'll flow back in, and, you know, I'm sure he has enough. But that's kind of one of the things with Neptune in the 2nd house. So if you're having issues with that and you have Neptune in the 2nd house, move your Neptune, right? Put it somewhere different. Moon in the 3rd house will open him up to communicate his emotions a little bit more freely in this location. So that's actually quite nice. So he'll be able to connect with people in communication on that deeper emotional level. He'll feel very comfortable there and at home in his community, with his neighbors. And even though there can be some intense situations that might come up with his neighbors as well, for the most part, he'd feel much more comfortable, much more safe, much more secure in that community. Putting his midheaven, though, in Cancer, let's see if that's how it is in his birth chart. His birth chart has the midheaven in Leo, which is common for, you know, actors and things like that, people who need to be in the public eye or be seen in the job that they're doing. You don't have to be an actor if you have your midheaven in Leo, but you have to be seen out in the open somehow. And, you know, I have my midheaven in Leo, right? I'm on YouTube. I didn't want to be on YouTube, but I am, right? That's what you got to do, that when you have the midheaven in Leo. And so he's got his midheaven in Leo. What this does actually when he moves to when he moves to LA or Hollywood is that it puts his midheaven in Cancer. And midheaven in Cancer is a similar energy to having the moon on the midheaven, where it's very hard to keep your private life private. And so this is not good if he doesn't want people gossiping about him, just because it's going to be very hard for him to keep what's going on behind the scenes in his home life and his family life beneath the surface. It's going to be hard to keep that under wraps. People are going to know about it. It's going to be more out in the open in this location, which can be a little maybe uncomfortable, depending on the person, right? I don't know him personally, so I don't know. But those are sort of the main things that change in his chart in LA versus, yeah. The only other thing is that it puts, no, it's still in the 5th house because he's got his North Node in the 5th house. It's still technically in the 5th. It's on the 6th house cusp. But yeah, so pretty much what's going on there is everything that I just said. I mean, there are a couple other things that we could get into, but that's the gist of it, right? So with the relocated chart, the main takeaway is to find the best planets in the chart. And for Vince Vaughn, I like his Jupiter. I think his Jupiter is quite nice. I would highlight his Jupiter, which is what he did living in Chicago. His Venus is pretty nice too. It's in conjunction with Pluto, which can, be a little bit difficult. Which, we can get into what in conjunctions mean at a different time, but his, Venus is also in a good connection with Mercury, which, indicates good communication and relationships. It also indicates that, he has a nice voice. People want to listen to him. He has a nice way of articulating himself. But also his Venus is in this really nice trine with his moon. So that's forging really deep, emotional, comfortable, sort of safe, secure connections with other people in his life, especially in his close personal relationships. And so, his Venus would be another one that would be nice to highlight. And so in his chart, in the United States, you could have his Venus descendant line going through North Dakota, Kansas, Mexico, all of this right here. That would be one way. It wouldn't shift his chart very much just because he was born in Minnesota, but it would highlight that, really nice Venus energy that he has. You could put it in a different location. It would change the chart entirely. And then the other line that I really like for him is, his Jupiter line, which is going through Chicago. Unless your Jupiter is really afflicted, you can't really go wrong with the Jupiter line. You just have to be aware if there are afflictions of what the downsides might be. So you can kind of, you can account for that and sort of negate that in some one way or another. But yeah, so I hope that you found this helpful. I did this more as like a tutorial. I'm going to be going in and explaining this more in depth, obviously, in the webinar. This is not something that you can just kind of learn on the fly necessarily, but I hope that I gave you enough examples so you can understand and get your feet wet and start playing around with your relocated chart, right? Because if you know just the basics of your planets, like Jupiter is a benefic planet. It brings expansion and good fortune. Where is your Jupiter, in your relocated chart? Your sun is going to be a very intense focal point in your relocated chart. So if you're taking your sun from one place to another, that's going to really shift your focus in this location. So those types of things, playing around with that can kind of help you get a feel for it. And of course, if you want to learn this more in depth, we're going to go into all the different sun placements. We're going to go into the personal planets. We're going to go into how to determine which planet is the best planet, and how to highlight that planet, and all of these different things. So we're going to be doing that in the webinar on September 15th. And of course, if you don't want to do the webinar and you just want me to do it for you, you can always book a reading with me. The link to do that is in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you guys have a wonderful week, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.